Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Storytelling, Philosophy, and Reception. I know it's been a very long time, but today we have the absolutely brilliant Maria Pretzler. Maria Pretzler
Hello.
is an associate professor in ancient history at Swansea University in Wales. Her research interests are Greek history. At the moment, she is focusing on the Peloponnese, especially the city-states of Arcadia. She has done a lot of work on Pausanias and has a wider interest in travel writing, geography, and mythology. Let's welcome Maria Pretzler. Hi, Maria.
Hi, thank you for this lovely introduction.
Tell us your keywords.
So, I think about traditions a lot, and one thing that particularly interests me is that I think the past changes with the needs of the present.
Oh, I love that. Okay. Uh, just to get the conversation going, why do you say that?
So, if you're looking at oral storytelling, I think what really happens, and my interest really lies in small communities that define their identities and explain to themselves and other people who they are with storytelling. And so what happens is that depending on when you are, what happens around you, who you need to be at any given point, the stories will have to change in order to cope with what's going on, explain who you are at any given point, and communities do change. Their priorities change. And so the stories they tell themselves and other people about who they are also have to change. Now, it's very important to understand that this is not kind of a cynical type of change. I mean, this no doubt sometimes happened in antiquity, but on the whole, I don't think that's the process. Someone sits down and thinks, I now have to kind of present ourselves like this way, so let's invent a story. It's rather, if you look at Greek myth, for example, but I think myth generally, there are always lots of versions of stories and there are lots of different stories. And so, in a way, you tell the stories that are important at that moment. And yes, they might change a bit. I think storytelling, oral storytelling, is very much like an evolutionary process. So you tell stories and then someone else tells them because they felt moved by them or they felt the story was relevant. And so slowly the story shifts. And it's very often a matter of selection rather than perhaps what really happens in the story. Although actual pretty radical changes can also happen. But I think very often it's what they are telling rather than just, really new inventions.
What storytelling traditions have you been researching recently or has taken your interest of late?
So, I mean, generally, my interest is very much in small Peloponnesian cities. I'm currently working on a big project on the Peloponnesian League. And in that
Oh,
context, actually, I've been thinking a lot about how some of the stories about what they would have thought of as history changed again with how they wanted to see themselves. So we do get stories. I mean, one example would be from the city of Tegea. Tegea is the northern neighbor of Sparta, so they really need to place themselves in some kind of context with Sparta. And there's a period after the Persian Wars when the Tegeans clearly didn't want to be allies of the Spartans, but their big heroic deeds had happened in the context of the Persian Wars when they were fighting alongside the Spartans. So suddenly their distant past is starting to take on all sorts of really interesting shapes. And no doubt these stories existed, but we get, for example, the story that a Tegean king fought went to the Isthmus of Corinth when the Heraclidae, so the descendants of Heracles, they wanted to come back to the Peloponnese and claim the rule of it. And the son of Heracles did this. The king of Tegea met him at the Isthmus, single combat. He kills the son of Heracles. And so the Heraclidae can't come into the Peloponnese. Now, those are the ancestors of the Spartans. So all of a sudden, that story of King Echemos becomes really important to the Tegeans, that they say, yes, we've sometimes fought alongside the Spartans, but our long ancient history is that we kept these Dorians, these ancestors of the Spartans, out of the Peloponnese. And that becomes a really important story for them. There was a monument on their marketplace, which actually may have been found even. So a monument showing King Echemos has been found and is in the Tegea Museum. So, and that was one of the many stories they had in their past, but this one became really important when it came about holding their own against the Spartans and their ancestors. And so you can kind of see, and then you can, if you see that different stories are selected at different times, you can sometimes really see where the historical context is, where that story fits, where it's all of a sudden really relevant to tell that particular story. So in the case of Tegea is when they turn away from Sparta after the Persian Wars, I would argue. And we actually have, Herodotus tells the story, and that's exactly in that period. So we are actually seeing what they were saying about themselves at that point and which myths they were telling, and they were in a shape that fitted that particular time. So the past had indeed adapted to exactly what they needed to be at that point.
That's amazing. And just going back a little bit, wow, they really integrated mythology into their history. Like that is a fact to them that these are
Yeah.
the descendants of Heracles, where that's a fact.
Yes.
What do you think of that? That's just a fact to them that there was a Heracles.
Yes. It's a bit more complicated. Yes, they do think this is history, although certainly by the Roman period, it's very hard to tell for the 5th century. But certainly by the Roman period, so I work a lot on Pausanias, for example, he's got a sense that there is history, as in events that we can actually really very clearly document. And then there is a past that happened, but was transmitted, for example, by poetry. And so you can't expect that the poets actually will exaggerate things, will add in fantastical elements. And that's very much anything before the Trojan War. And then you get actually stories about a past that's even earlier, that's also true in its own way, but perhaps not historically true, which is stories about when the gods walked the earth really early. So there is a sense of slightly different quality of the past, and also a different quality of how it's remembered. And the interesting thing is that the Trojan War is very much the cutoff line, and many people in antiquity absolutely thought that Homer was a kind of historical truth teller, with some fantastical bits because Homer is a poet, but nevertheless, so they felt that that was definitely history, and that's very much the cutoff line. One sees this quite often. Um, for example, Diodorus writes Universal History, and he starts with Heracles. Actually, it goes from Heracles to Diodorus' own time, which is at the time of Julius Caesar, 1st century BC. And he says, well, from Heracles to the Trojan War, we have to kind of improvise, and then slowly the dates get more. After the Trojan War, information gets clearer. And he says that really explicitly at the beginning of the work. But you can see in Diodorus that really he thinks with Heracles, you can start writing history, it's a bit vague, and then you slowly fade into something that you can really know. But it is part of historiography for them.
That's amazing. You know, I have never been to the Peloponnesus. I know, shock, but like I've wanted to go there so badly, and just I could just never cross over. It's like, Athens, and I've been to places in the mainland and islands, and then haven't been to Corinth and then beyond. Like, wow. And I would love to get to uh, Cythereus Island at some point because
Mm.
what and you can tell me more about this since Peloponnesus is your study. Um, I've been thinking, I thought many times how Helen, uh, if you follow Homer's Helen, that she is a daughter of Zeus and therefore a half sister to Aphrodite,
Mm.
and Aphrodite came from Cyprus, and
Mm.
went to Cythera, and Uh, and Kithara is like right there underneath, looking at a map, underneath Sparta. I don't, I mean, by boat, by plane, I don't really know what's the distance between Kithara and Sparta. Have you gone?
I've not been to Kithara. I mean, it's not that far away, actually. So, so yeah, I mean, going from, I mean, these days getting to Sparta is quite easy. You then have to get a bit further south. It is possible to do. I mean, you'd have to, the port of Sparta is Githion, as it was in antiquity, and one would presumably leave from there. But I've not made the journey myself, but it is very close. And actually, if you look at ancient traditions about, I mean, Pausanias talks about this. The island of Kythera was thought to be the place where Paris and Helen, as they were off to Troy, made their first stop, and there was a sanctuary commemorating that. So yes, I mean, the landscape was very much marked by that journey, and you know, Kythera is kind of the last stop before you cross over the Aegean.
These, what book is that from? Just a general
Yeah.
thing so I can look at it now because
Yeah,
I'm
so
like, wow.
book three is Laconia, so that's what it is. You probably, you know, it's at least 20 chapters in, but I can't tell you exactly how many chapters.
Sure,
But
sure.
you have to get through the city of Sparta first till he gets to Githian and then Kythera. I mean, it's not a very long passage about the island, but it's there. Um, so
That's
yeah.
so fun.
And the thing is, it does, of course, matter where, you know, if you go along with my idea that the way stories are told and which stories are told does change with the context, it is really
Absolutely.
important to know where that bit comes from. And to
Yes.
me, it's always fascinating, particularly if I've got different versions of a myth from different times. And that can happen. So, for example, Herodotus has quite a bit of local myth, and then Pausanias picks up something that's a bit different, and you get a sense of how those stories were told in the Roman imperial period, and so on. And by that point, for example, monuments influence stories. Once it's depicted, for example, on a temple, that's fixed. It's very hard to change a story once it's depicted on a monument that's really important to people.
And
Um,
cults of
and so on.
Helen,
So you
yeah.
know, some of these versions get fixed in time for various reasons.
Now, in your actual physical wanderings around the Peloponnesus, have you encountered the ruins of the temples to Helen and Menelaus? Because I know that there's some cults there, and I don't know.
Yeah, in Sparta, there's the Menelion, which is a really lovely place with one of the best views in Greece. I know. I would argue if you like to look at one of the most beautiful mountain ranges I'm aware of, and I'm from the Alps, and I've got standards. If most beautiful view of Mount Taygetos. Yeah, I mean it's a bit outside Sparta. Yeah, I mean there is some archaeological remains in Sparta. It's quite difficult actually. It's many of the remains are from Roman times. Outside Sparta, you get some of the rural sanctuaries. There have been remains found, but yes, I mean, Sparta is beautiful to visit, has a lovely museum, and hopefully very soon a very new, lovely museum.
Ooh.
But yeah, I mean, there are some important sites, but yeah. My speciality is really, I mean, I've obviously been to Sparta and looked at various places there, but my main area in the Peloponnese is Arcadia. So a bit further north and right in the middle of the peninsula.
So there's going to be a Spartan museum that they're working on, a new one, and
Yes.
wonderful.
There is currently a museum as well. I mean, I don't know, I have to say, because it's been a while that I've been to Sparta, unfortunately. I don't know how far they're away from opening the new museum. I don't think it has happened. I think I would have heard that. So yeah. Um, but in any case, yeah, it is a very lovely place. I mean, I've been there on study trips with students quite often, and every time someone came to me and said, "I didn't believe that Sparta was this beautiful," It is an absolutely gorgeous place. And when you go there in April, the whole city has the scent of orange blossom. It's absolutely not what you think Spartan might be like. And
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
it would have been gorgeous in antiquity, probably, well, without the citrus trees, of course, that they weren't there yet, but it would have been a very beautiful place in antiquity as well. And I don't think we should kind of, forget about this. I mean, we always think about Sparta as austere and Spartan, but actually, it is a beautiful place, and it would have been back then too.
I saw pictures quite a while back from somebody who visited the museums in Sparta, and I was at the time really surprised by the artwork that was there. Archaic period, I think, is what I saw.
Yes.
Whatever it was,
Mm.
I was shocked. I was like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize," because at least in American history, people love to talk about the Spartan culture as being austere, and it's all, um, you know, yeah, without knowing real history, you get like all this
I
other
mean,
stuff that's yeah.
so what you're saying is not actually wrong. It's just it depends when you are in Sparta. So archaic Sparta actually produced very beautiful pottery. There are lots of, I mean, thousands, tens of thousands of little votive dedications from the temple of Artemis or Thea. And so, yes, I mean, certainly I'd say, to the early 6th century, you have quite a bit of artistic production in Sparta. Then it does tail off a bit. Never disappears completely. There were perioikoi. So, if you've got the Spartans themselves in the 5 villages of Sparta, but then you also get towns around it that, they were part of the Spartan state. They weren't citizens, but their lives were probably quite, like Greek city states, and there were definitely artisans there and so on. There's certainly less. I mean, it is absolutely true. There's really not a lot of Spartan artistic production from the classical period. And so, yeah, I mean, so it's not wrong, but of course the museum displays what they have. So that's obviously from the periods where the Spartans did produce such things. And yes, I mean, it is interesting, but it does look different from other places. There is no question. I mean, it is a unique culture. So
You
yeah, and
mentioned
that's why the Spartan Museum is worth visiting too.
absolutely, yeah. You mentioned that citrus, of course, wasn't around at the time because did that arrive like Byzantine period? When did the citrus arrive?
I don't know when it arrived into Greece. I mean, the Romans started, I think, I don't know. I mean, at some point in the Roman period, it becomes available. When they start growing it, particularly in large amounts, I'm not sure, probably quite late. I mean, there are photographs, I don't know about Sparta, but certainly the Argolid. There are photographs of the Argolid, even with still lots of grain fields. And so the citrus, large citrus plantations, I mean, that is quite recent. I mean, that's the last 100 years or less, actually. That there was a shift simply because grain growing in Greece was not as lucrative as some other cash crops. I think that's how it is. So the landscape has actually changed quite considerably in the last few decades, particularly. There's still lots of olive trees in Laconia as well, but the best watered kind of plains in the Peloponnese, if they're low enough, will have citrus trees. That's really, particularly the Argolid in Laconia. You get more olive in Messenia and in Elis, and up in Arcadia, all of this doesn't grow because it's too cold. So you get in Arcadia, the trees are cherry trees and walnut trees.
Were cherries around? Moving on to Arcadia, which is your specialty. Were cherry trees around from
No,
No,
not
not cherry
well.
season.
Again, they come in the Roman period.
Okay.
Now the the legend about cherry trees is that they were brought from Asia Minor by Lucius Licinius Lucullus, who was a Roman politician of the 1st century BC. He was basically replaced in quite a cruel manner by Pompey in what I think was the 50s BC. Don't quote me on this. But in any case, so the idea was that he brought the cherry. I'm not sure whether that is specifically true, because very often such things get connected to famous people. And Lucullus was famous for being obsessed with luxurious food. But certainly the Romans brought it in at some point. So classical Greece, no cherries. Quite possibly that by the time Pausanias goes there are some. They certainly were spread into large parts of Europe, also northwestern Europe, by the Romans. So yeah. But walnuts, as far as I'm aware, are actually native to Greece.
Oh, okay. So
There were various places that have walnuts in there. So, for example, Caria, which is the place after which the Caryatids are called, because Caryatid means woman from Caria, and it's a place just between Tegea and Sparta, and that means walnut village. So, and that place. So, yeah, I mean, so walnuts definitely have been around in Greece for a long time. They certainly fit. So there we are. I don't know how we've ended up with agriculture, but there we are. I think it is important and interesting to know what grows now and what used to grow there. I always think, because for them, growing food is so central to their lives, that thinking about that is really important. And in the Peloponnese, because it's so mountainous, different places have a very different climate. And you go higher up and you can't grow olive trees, for example, so the olive oil has to be traded, and so on. I mean, you go really high up, and frankly, you can just about grow vines, but the wine is not very sweet. I can tell you from personal experience. But yeah, I mean, some of Arcadia has an alpine climate, not a Mediterranean climate. So you get across the Peloponnese, you get very different landscapes, different climates, very different winters. Up in the mountains, there is snow for a while, and so on. And so that really makes it means that people have to constantly connect with each other to exchange things. So the mountains actually make people connect. They don't necessarily divide people. They force you to talk to people lower down or higher up.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so say that again, because I was just talking to a dear friend of mine yesterday while watching the Odyssey, and they were saying how, and they were asking really, like, I don't understand. I thought, Greece is such a small country. Why do they act like it's so divided up? And I had simplistically said, oh, well, there are mountains that really cut off people from each other. But now you're saying that this, some mountains actually connect people. Can you go back and explain that?
Yeah, so I mean, the cutting off is not entirely untrue either, right? I mean, there is a reason why you've got these city-states that kind of stay on their own. Because you do have these, certainly in the mountains, for example, I mean, the Peloponnese is really extreme, so it's easy to say. Even if you look at, say, a satellite view of the Peloponnese, you'll see the mountains and then the green plains. And they are very much like islands where you can grow things between the mountains. And that's your kind of secluded place that becomes one community, very often one city-state. So the mountains do no doubt invite that way of dividing up the kind of communities into very independent little pockets. But at the same time, they do talk to each other. So if you were in Arcadia, no doubt, because you're Greek, you do want your olive oil, and you do have to talk to your neighbors lower down to do this, to get olive oil, for example. But also, I mean, in modern times, we don't know whether this happened in antiquity, but in modern times, they took the animals down in winter, because up in the mountains, there might be a few weeks of snow in the valley bottoms even. So you can't graze the animals. And so you go down. there are places, for example, in the Agolid, there is a village called Arcadia, which obviously means Acadian village. And that was a winter village. So people would live there with their animals in winter, and then in summer, they would go home to Arcadia. Transhumance was very widely practiced in the 19th century, early 20th century Peloponnese. We don't know whether that's the case in antiquity, but the animals must have moved somehow. So that's another thing that, depending on, and in summer you do want the animals up in the mountains where you can't grow grain. So, they are kind of out of your way. You do the grain harvesting. And then, someone looks after the animals up in the mountains. So there is a lot of movement has to go on. And then, you drive the animals down to markets in the larger centers closer to the coast. And so there must have been, and because the climate is so different and you don't actually have everything, you have to connect. And the high mountains in the Peloponnese, but elsewhere in Greece as well, they have the better trees. So if you want some reasonable timber, you need it from there probably. And so there is constant exchange necessary and also desirable because the different parts have very different produce.
This is so fun to talk to you about. Oh my gosh, I'm learning so much right now. All right, your specialty is Arcadia, not Sparta. I know. Arcadia, I know not much about except what we've talked about, off recording, and so can I ask you, like, why Arcadia?
So that really happened when I was an undergrad. In my first year in 1991, and that dates me a bit, we went on to a big 2-week study trip to Greece, and we started in the north. And there were two colleagues of mine who were older and had already knew Greece, and they kept saying, wait till we get to Arcadia. And by the time we got to Arcadia, I mean, it fulfilled all the promises. So, yes, and I absolutely love it. I think the landscape is beautiful. It's very mountainous. And then I did 2 archaeological projects there, first with my home university in Graz in Austria, at Fennos in North Arcadia, and then with the Norwegian team in Tegea while I was a postgrad. And Tegea particularly still feels a bit like home to me. And yeah, I just love Arcadia and lots of very small city-states. And I really like studying small communities. So Arcadia is a place that really suits me. And so then my PhD thesis was on Pausanias Book 8, which is Arcadia again, and his description of all these places, because for many of them, the main bulk of information we've got comes from Pausanias, very late, of course, but nevertheless, extremely valuable. So
Can
yeah,
you
that's
can you
my
walk me
relationship with Arcadia.
can you walk me through the landscape of Arcadia? Because to me, it's not real unless we're talking about the smells of trees and walking around. And I mean, you must have fallen in love with it when you were there.
Yes, I mean, people sometimes, whenever say I showed photographs of Arcadia, people always accused me of, well, so you go and you do archaeology where it looks like back home in the Alps. And in a way, there are parts of Arcadia, particularly the mountainous north. I mean, it's all mountainous, but the north is even more mountainous, and that looks very alpine. And the climate is quite alpine as well, actually. So on the high mountains, you actually have fir trees, and you definitely, as soon as you go up into Arcadia, you don't have olive trees anymore. So it's really quite a different place. Now it's a karst landscape, so it's limestone. And there are quite a few valleys in Arcadia where the water doesn't flow off through a valley, but it is actually a closed uh, valley, and the water disappears in a hole somewhere or in a cave somewhere. And so you've got these closed off valleys, and however you want to get there, you always have to cross a mountain pass. And then at the valley bottom, it's usually very flat alluvial soil where the fields are. And there's a lot of water in Arcadia. There are actually so in some valleys, actually too much water is more problem than too little. It's quite a different kind of place. So yeah, but if you go around Arcadia in a car, you definitely have to get used to driving lots of mountain passes. Or if you walk at a very mountainous pass, very beautiful. I mean, increasingly you actually get really nice walking routes on the old Ottoman roads, or even sometimes ancient roads through Arcadia. It's quite the place. But yeah, and many places very remote, you find the most fantastical mountain towns and villages even now. It is really a very exciting place. Many people, I think, only go through it on the motorway, but it's very kind of rewarding to get off the motorway and get into some of the valleys and experience it properly. It's a very beautiful part of Greece.
In the ancient times, how did the people get the food from in the mountains? Like I don't think of mountains as a place where, there's lots of agricultural production, or did they, yeah, how did that work?
Well, there is. I mean, Arcadia is much more famous for its pasture, so there's no question there was a lot of animal grazing, and the animals would graze very high up in the mountains, particularly in summer. We don't know what they did with them in winter. They may have moved them down towards the coast, so outside Arcadia. That's certainly the case in the 19th and early 20th century. People in the Peloponnese practiced transhumance, which means that they actually lived in summer villages in Arcadia in summer, and in winter they moved down. And in places like the Agolith, there were winter villages where they moved with their animals. So we don't know whether that happened in antiquity, but I would assume some of the animals would have moved down closer to the sea, actually. But you can plow the valleys. I've already said there are very nice flat valley bottoms which are well watered. Nowadays, there is certainly some produce that grows best in Arcadia. So watermelon is, for example, something that gets grown a lot there, simply because there is enough water, which isn't true for everywhere in Greece. Yeah, grain growing works really well. Nowadays, the lower lying parts of Arcadia, which is still pretty high, still above the olive line, some of these places have extremely good wine, for example. The further up you go, the more difficult even the wine gets. But yeah, I mean, grain is fine. And so there is definitely agriculture, but the land is limited because a lot of it is very steep slope. And so, for example, one typical thing for Arcadia is that there were many mercenaries, and one assumption is that they would have been second sons, because whenever you've got two sons or more, the farm gets split. That's how inheritance works in Greece. Now, if the farm just about feeds one family, you can't split it, because otherwise you've got two families who can't feed themselves. So there was probably often a surplus of young men who simply wouldn't get a chance to inherit land because there wasn't enough. So that's definitely the case. I think wealthy Acadians, I mean, there's been some research on the Acadian economy back in antiquity by Jim Roy, who is very much the Acadian scholar. He really started the research into Arcadia, and has done some important work. And so, yeah, I mean, he absolutely argues that some of the wealthy people in Arcadia, and there were wealthy people, actually got their wealth probably from large-scale pasture and using those mountain slopes with goats and sheep mostly, and that you could get wealthy. At least some people could. And so, yeah, I mean, but that's what the economy looks like.
Your big project. Can we talk about your big project that you're working on the Peloponnesus?
Yeah, so I'm working on the Peloponnesian League. This is a very long-standing project of mine that's been advancing quite slowly because lots of other things happened and so on. But yes, I mean, one might say that, what needs to be said on the Peloponnesian League has been said. Now, that's true if you do it from a Spartan point of view. If you want to know what Sparta got out of it and how they ran the thing, that's probably right. But I really want to think about the Peloponnesian League from the point of view of the member states. Now, that includes many of my dear Acadians, but of course, there are others as well in the Agulid, and of course, Corinth, the largest ally. Elis is another very important allied state. After by the middle of the classical period, the Achaean states as well. There is a time when there were quite a few allies outside the Peloponnese as well. So I'm not just looking at Arcadia. But for the Peloponnesians particularly, that was an alliance that went on for several generations. Certainly from the later 5th century on, they would have been on campaign almost every summer. So people knew each other. It means a completely new set of quite close networks. And the relationships really must have changed through this very long-standing alliance. Also, the opportunities these places had. Some of the smaller member states, they might be kind of places with an army of less than 500 people, but they get involved in the big world events of the Greek world. And if you fight alongside Sparta, you win almost every time. You bring home booty. You bring home booty that your little army would never have been able to bring home. So this actually has an impact on how Arcadia works. So that seems to be one of the few regions, for example, that made it out of the Peloponnesian War possibly even more prosperous than before. I mean, in the rest of the areas that were involved in the Peloponnesian War, it caused a lot of misery. But some of the allies of Sparta, probably not, because they weren't ever raided. No enemies reached them, but they went out every year and raided other people. So, there are all sorts of... So once one starts to think about the problem of this long-standing collaboration, with other factors in mind, then actually I think there's quite a bit of interesting work that needs to be done, and I'm hoping to do that work.
What do you think is surprising to a lot of people that they don't know about when they think of the Peloponnesus and they think of and you're focusing on the small city states? What is it that's unexpected?
I think what's unexpected about some of these small city states is just how much they managed to do, and how much of a difference they did manage to make sometimes in what we might call world politics. What I like about studying Greek history this way is that it isn't just about the big cities. I mean, if you get a kind of Greek history 101 introductory course, it's all about Athens and Sparta, and mostly about Athens, really. But actually, if you want to understand what happens in Greek history, it's those swarms of cities that are kind of circling around the big centers and actually are tugging them one way or the other. I always think of them a bit like a big planet with lots of moons that actually make it wobble, and kind of, it's a bit like this. If we don't understand the movements and interests of the small ones, we don't actually capture how decision making works, how these kind of bigger states make the decisions, and particularly both of them have large alliances of very small states around them, and that does have consequences. They are not free movers, actually, and so one has to write Greek history with this in mind, I think, and that's certainly what I'm trying to do. It is a lot of work because you really have to constantly chase up all these kind of small factors and quite complicated sources. We have not a lot of source material. So reading between the lines and between the lines of inscriptions and some pots that have been found in a rescue dig somewhere and so on is very much what I need to do. So, it is a complicated thing to do, but I think it's so worthwhile to bring that extra factor in. These dozens, if not hundreds of little states that actually do make an impact, certainly as a swarm, they do somehow. So I think that is quite important, I think.
How many of those little states were from the catalog of ships in book 2, which is where is it?
Oh yes.
Oh my gosh, where's my book 2? It's someplace. What did I do with my books? Where are they? They're always like near and dear. Oh, here they are. Okay, hang on. Homer.
There we are.
Odyssey. Okay, hang on. Odyssey 2. Iliad 1 through 12. Here we are.
There we are.
Catalog of ships. I get so excited. You're one of the few that get excited with me.
Oh, I love the catalog of ships. I sometimes annoy people by saying it's the best bit in the Iliad.
It's the best. It's the best.
I mean, and if you think that I have an interest in geography, that is the first geographical text in some ways. It organizes Greece in routes Now, not all of it is as old as the main bulk of the Iliad, of course, but that's also interesting. It's a fascinating piece of work. And I've got in Arcadia, I've got cities that are in, and I've got cities that are not in. And some of these cities in Pausanias actually have stories that explain why they are not in. So it must have been such a people would have asked, why aren't you in the catalogue of ships? Or people would have said, this is so annoying. Our neighbors are in the catalogue and we are not. And so here is our story. Our king at this time went to Aulis with Agamemnon and he wanted to go to Troy. And he was a really grumpy kind of person, and he fell out with Agamemnon, and so he went back home in a huff. And that's why we are not in the catalogue. You get stories like this, and it tells you how important it was. And I always imagine, that these poets, even before perhaps it was fixed, people always think it really only got into place. The last bit, maybe the Athenian bit, the came in under Pisistratus, so second half 6th century. But the poets would go around and at festivals and so on perform bits of these epics, or all of them. And as the catalogue starts up, it's not a boring list because you're waiting for you to arrive, right? And because it's in roots, it's coming closer. It's coming closer. That's our neighbors. And then, wait, where are we? Or, yes, that's us. And you can almost imagine, in a festival like Delphi, people would kind of say, yay! I always imagine that. That's completely made up by me. But you have to think that that's the bit that writes you and your community into the Trojan War. And it must have been highly emotional for people to wait for their name to come up. And as it's recited, you can imagine. And then the people mentioned in the Iliad, they are linked with local stories because, of course, if it's in the Iliad, it's important. That's a bit of your myth that you always have to answer for. A foreigner comes to visit and say, well, I know the Iliad by heart. And I know in your city, this guy is mentioned. That's what else happened to that king? Did he come home? What happened? And so you always have to answer for your catalogue entry. And if you look at Pausanias, almost all of them have, stories that go around the catalogue of ships, if they're in it. And so that ties in with the local genealogy and, so on. So this 2 lines about your city actually balloons into something much bigger.
Sure. Before I got distracted by my dissertation, when I sang the entire Iliad Book 1, all 611 lines, and I put it on YouTube. I actually, that was, I had went ahead and I did all the meters. I was counting, and it's not always easy as people think to do, dactylic hexameter because of the corruptions that happen. And so I had a lot of help from Armand Dangour with things. But I actually went through the entire 24 books. And my ambition was after singing the first book, I would go on to my favorite, the catalog of ships.
I'm in. Please do it. I'd love to hear that. And I wonder how you'd handle the place names. Because actually, I'm assuming if you perform the catalogue of ships, the names in it are actually really important. That, because people would wait for them, I think. Look, I'm purely imagining this. I don't think we have evidence of this, but I imagine that actually really matters to people, the names of the leaders and the names of the places. And it would be really fascinating. I have to say, I remember coming across your Iliad 1, and of course, now you've got new bits of Iliad and Odyssey out, and it is absolutely fascinating. I think it's wonderful, partly because you pay so much attention, right? You have gone through the verses. One can hear how the melody maps onto the Greek language, which is clearly how this poetry would have been performed. I think it is amazing. And everyone needs to listen to it. I'm saying this right now. And
thank you.
I also, because we obviously don't know how this goes, and various people have tried to reconstruct it. But I think also the idea that you can actually take this fairly rigid way of performing something and give it different flavors. I mean, I've listened to your really new versions of, the enchantments of Circe and the sirens and so on, and they all have their own sound. And of course, you still do the meter, but at the same time, you can see how a poet could give the different bits of the scenery different flavors. And I mean, obviously, they have very different. There's a very different atmosphere in different scenes, and
Right.
whether it's a prayer or whether it's some monstrous people kind of trying to seduce sailors, and obviously there's a different sound, but how you do that. And I really love the experimental way of saying, okay, how do we do this while sticking to the format that it needs to have. And yeah, I've learned a lot from listening. I
Oh,
mean, I
thank
have to
you.
re-listen to the new album because, it's so new that I haven't had enough time to really kind of ponder it. But I think, yeah, I mean, that's going to be, and my students will get to hear this because they need to, whenever I teach my Archaic Greece course, which I will do in autumn, there is always a week on the poems before they turn up as sources in all sorts of places, and we discuss whether they can be sources. And I always start the first session on this with just playing a reconstructed form of it, or sometimes even different people's versions. And it's really, suddenly the classroom gets this kind of slightly different feel to it when you've got the epic poetry sounding through the space. And I do like to have a female voice for it, simply because we just assume it's all men, and of course the bards or poets in the Odyssey are men, of course. But surely, I mean, these centuries of transmitting poetry, and families presumably of poets who were this was recited and passed to the next generation. Look, we don't know, but we also don't know that it was only men. And I'm thinking these women sitting at home in a household where poetry is recited and newly, and people practice how to kind of reassemble it for each performance and so on. And these women sitting at their looms and spinning, I mean, all these very kind of, these woolworking activities that take so long, but also very rhythmical. I mean, why wouldn't they have sung poetry? And so,
Yeah, mothers are the first teachers of their
yeah,
little ones. And even according to Spartan education stuff that I read even long ago, even for Spartans, the little ones, boys and girls, were under their mother's care till they were, what, 6 or 7. And
yeah,
that's typical
yeah,
of all the city-states of Greece.
yeah,
Um, so, yes, they will, then the boys get separated later, but at an early stage, who the heck is taking care of the musical instruments? It's
yes,
not the children, it's not the dad.
mm,
Let's assume, okay, perhaps they go to their Greek teacher, and
mm,
he has the instruments there.
mm,
But yes and no on that. How many children is he teaching? Um,
yeah,
Myself, I have a collection. I have like the largest collection in the US, I think, of
mm,
of the replica instruments. And and I mean, I'm thinking each one costs. Maybe they made
mm,
their own, but how many people in a household who's going to make, you can't make your own, you have to have an actual craftsman uh make a lyre.
yeah,
All
mm,
these things in mind, like who had them so that they could play them. You can't just be passing around if you're doing music
mm,
class. So
yeah,
I'm thinking several have their own, and
mm,
each one has to be cared for in some way. What when the string breaks, what do they what do they do? It's I'm assuming the mother, again, I don't have proof for this, but I'm
no,
thinking because the women are not written into the documents so much. Even reading
mm,
uh, Andromache Karanika's wonderful book about women's work and
Mm.
you know what they do and the songs that they sing at home and such. It doesn't mention musical instruments, which is a bummer for me because I would like it to.
And I mean, I think it's very difficult because whenever a woman with a musical instrument turns up somewhere, it does sometimes happen on vases and so on. It's assumed it's a hetaira, and often the setting would suggest that that's true because we are in a symposium, and women who are in a symposium,
But that's
probably
during
are
classical age,
hetaira.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's classical age. And, so it is quite tricky for classical period, certainly. I mean, Hellenistic, we do have women with
Hellenistic,
instruments, don't we?
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
Hellenistic, we have traveling women
yeah,
musicians. And
yeah,
but we
exactly.
have archaic period, we have Carina,
Yeah,
we have Sappho,
yeah, yeah.
right?
And clearly, it's one issue is that most of our classical material, and whether it's vases or buildings or sculpture or text, is from Athens. And the Athenians didn't really like to talk about free, respectable women. I mean, to the point where you don't mention her name, right? I mean, that's the polite
Problem.
thing to do. And so there is an issue with classical Athens and therefore with the classical period because most of our sources are from there. And it's very hard to get around that. So, yes, I mean, and it may well be the case that women didn't have the same formal education, as in, memorize the whole Iliad, that kind of thing, that some boys did. But nevertheless, if you are in a household where this poetry is recited by someone, surely, you don't, in some ways, kids learn by osmosis almost. Look, we are really speculating. We can't prove this. But I think it's really important to at least consider it because I think in the past, so often, because, we don't know about women, and actually, there isn't that much evidence about men doing all of that either. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, the evidence as a whole is very small.
That's true.
And I just don't think that absence of evidence is also evidence of absence in this case. So, we can't say anything for certain, but we shouldn't. I think ruling it out actually is probably the wrong path here. That's all I'm saying. And that's why I like you kind of reciting this music or, performing this music and poetry because it reminds people that female voices have a place in this. And I think it's really important to think about this. And also, if we assume women are performing this, particularly if we think about how this poetry comes about, the centuries of reciting and rearranging till it gets written down, if we think that, not all of the people who contributed verses were men, I think that's a good thing. And in the past, scholars have sometimes suggested this, and very often it's kind of, oh, this bit, it describes jewelry in great detail. That must be a woman who did it. And I don't think we should think like that. Why shouldn't women get excited by fight scenes? So, the stereotyping is also, we shouldn't stereotype in a way. But yeah, I mean, I think to me, I value these poems also because I think they are the sum total of hundreds of years and hundreds of people thinking very deeply about storytelling, about entertainment, but also about deep questions like what does war mean? What does home mean? What does going out into the unknown mean? And so on, right? So, and hundreds of years of people thinking about this. I think that makes the poem so deep because one person couldn't create something. This, that's the same as what hundreds of people kind of, bits pieced together and over centuries, the best bits being remembered, and lots of bits that weren't so good just didn't make it. And so, you get, in a way, the best quality and some of the most interesting thinking of hundreds of people over centuries across different cultures almost. And I want that to include women. so,
Well,
so I think that is really important to at least not rule it out. I think that's certainly what we should do.
thank you. Thank you so much for yeah, that's so encouraging. When I started the whole thing, and with my question is how did Homer sounded, I was trying to work my way through that, and then I realized I also wanted to know how how did Homer sound to a woman performing it,
Yeah,
because like Sappho was the other person I would think of when I'm thinking, you know, some not epic, but like
yeah,
someone who was a musician and a poet who was respected. And she was absolutely respected. Nobody said, "Oh, she's great for a
mm,
woman." You know, it's like, "Oh, she great. She was great. She won the
yeah,
prizes for this or
absolutely.
that." And in her work, in her own rhythms, you know, which Sapphic rhythm is its own thing, really fun, by the way. Uh, in her work, she talks about Helen in there. I mean,
Yeah.
um, the the song that I call the most beautiful thing, and not in this
Mm,
album, but in my other upcoming album,
mm,
um, and it's it's out there. It's the one that I call the most beautiful thing when she's saying, some say that the most beautiful thing is the ships, the horses, and
mm, mm,
but Helen, and then she talks about Helen, and then she says, but I think the most beautiful thing is the one you desire, the one you
mm.
love, and um, that is her rethinking
Yeah,
mythology,
yeah.
and
And
that's
intertext.
one woman
Yeah.
poet who interpreted it and took it to her own and made music out of it and made poetry out of it. That's her reaching out and synthesizing the mythology.
Mm,
And when I've written poetry in English
mm,
about and I've been working on a project. I have so many different projects, but that's a separate thing entirely. But just dealing with just the text itself, uh, going into Penelope, for instance, and what was Penelope thinking as she's depressed? And yes, these are her words. I captured her words
mm,
there, and trying to imagine. Okay, Penelope isn't playing a lyre because it doesn't ever show anyone. I think we talked about this offline. Is that not even muses in any text, literature, anything, ever played a lyre or a
mm.
musical instrument. Not a muse, not even the muse, not any of those 12 daughters of culture from memory, which it's its own thing, isn't it? Isn't that beautiful? That
Yeah.
from memory there's
Mm,
culture, and these are the goddesses who are responsible for culture.
mm,
It's amazing, and they're women. It's not Apollo that's in charge of
mm.
culture, right?
Yeah.
Um, so, there's a place there for females, for women, for mothers, for teachers who are female, who are goddesses. There's a place of respect there, which Homer held. I mean,
Mm,
that's one of the things that I'm not going to rant here, but um, there's Nolan's Odyssey, and then there's the
mm.
Odyssey by Homer,
Yeah.
where
Mm,
there was a lot of voice given to Circe, to Calypso,
mm,
to Helen. Helen appeared in two different books. Helen was kind, intelligent, and respected by
mm.
Menelaus, by her household.
Yes. Mm.
Okay, anyways, and
Yeah.
that's
And
the voice I wanted to say, and even the sirens are not sexy in
yeah,
the Odyssey. They say
no.
things, and I sang the things that they said. They're
Yeah.
prophets. I,
Yeah, absolutely. And then you've got the Phaeacians where you have to go to the queen first and beg her to be taken into the household as a guest. And you have to be extremely polite to Nausicaa. Even if you don't wear any clothes. And the way, I mean, it's so lovely how Odysseus, the man who basically brazens out everything, but he's actually quite embarrassed in front of Nausicaa. It's so beautiful, and the way he tries to be extremely polite, And I mean, there is a really, and of course he doesn't know where he is and what kind of people they are, but the first woman you meet on the beach who seems clearly wealthy, and that probably, although she does her washing herself, I mean, obviously with many enslaved women around her, but still, but nevertheless, you have to be polite to women. And then she says, I mean, the first thing you do is to go to the queen and ask her to be taken in. And all this, I mean, of course, this is a very different world from 5th century Athens, but yes. And I mean, Helen, who really, I mean, she is really the mistress of her household alongside Menelaus. And yeah, I mean, the film does not do that. I mean, it's interesting because Penelope has kind of that role, but even she is kind of hidden away, a bit like an Athenian woman would have been. I mean, yeah, in the Odyssey, she does go upstairs. I mean, there are women's quarters. I mean, one gets a sense that there is a private part of the house, but yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the role of women in these epics is really quite different from what we see in Athenian texts, but also certainly what we see in the most recent movie. I agree. I mean, it's really a different world in so many ways.
Well, Maria, we have been talking for a while, and I can talk with you like endlessly, as we've seen, and it's just like a never. You're just so you're brilliant, and I know that your research will keep generating more conversation out there with everyone, including myself. Um,
I hope so. That Yeah, let's keep chatting.
we will keep chatting. I would, if you let me close this with, can I ask you what's going on with et ego in Arcadia? Because that's what I think of Arcadia. That's what I think of. Yeah.
That's not quite the Arcadia that I do research in, actually. So it does come from antiquity. So I have to kind of give you a bit of a backstory because it actually starts in Sicily. So bucolic poetry was invented by Theocritus, as far as we know anyway, very, very much for people living in the big city and longing for the countryside. And his bucolic poetry is set in Sicily. And then Virgil runs with the genre as well, and mostly still has people who probably are I mean, they're in a landscape that feels more Sicilian than anything. But two of his eclogues are specifically set in Arcadia. And in one of them, we come across a tomb with, and we get the phrase et ego in Arcadia, which actually means you've got this idyllic landscape, but and the person speaking, I am too in Arcadia. The person speaking is death. And so the idea is that this is such an idyllic place that we dream ourselves into, the kind of simple life and so on. But death is still also in Arcadia. Now, the whole link between kind of shepherd's romance and so on and Arcadia, and the emphasis on this slogan actually comes much later. So it's really a big thing in the Renaissance in Italy. And then later in the 18th century, I mean, the kind of shepherd romances, that kind of stuff is very often set in Arcadia. So it starts with these two poems by Virgil and then gets out of hand. So Romantic Arcadia, in many ways, has its roots in antiquity, mostly in the Roman world, and with a bit of Hellenistic influence from Theocritus, and then really develops much later. But that's where that comes from. But yes, the speaker of that sentence is death, and people are always quite surprised about that. Well, thank you very much for this. I mean, I have to say, we started chatting some time ago about the Odyssey and so on, and also because you started performing bits of the Odyssey, which fascinated me, and it's been wonderful to start talking about all sorts of other things that we're both interested in. And I have to say, meeting someone else who finds, like me, that the catalogue of ships is a wonderful thing, I mean, that alone is just fantastic.
Well,
So,
thank
yes,
you. When I start
fellow
singing it,
catalog fan. I mean, yes, I think
when I start singing it, I will definitely be like getting a hold of you and texting you going, Maria, I am now singing about
yes,
such and such.
yes. even just a little bit, how about you start the few verses on Arcadia? How
Y-
about that?
yes, I will. Just for you, since I had performed Homer in the Grove for University of Florida some time ago, and I think I was singing for them. Um, oh gosh, what there it was somebody's request. So, but I'm going to take your request because as a fellow appreciator of the this catalog of ships, I'm even going to say, before I perform it on my YouTube, this one is for you, Marie.
Wonderful. I would feel very honored. And you'll see it contains every single ancient Akkadian stereotype. So there's no romantic shepherds, but all the other things, the Akkadians borrow their ships from Agamemnon because they don't understand thalassina erga, the things of the sea. It's all in there. And the Athenians, for the rest of antiquity, the Akkadians kind of try to live up to those stereotypes that the catalog sets up for them. It is actually quite wonderful. Anyway,
Thank you so
if
much
you
for
ever
being
get
here.
round to that, I will feel extremely honored and joyful. But thank you so much. I mean,
Thank
this,
you.
yeah,
This was so
what a fun
fun.
conversation. Yeah,
I will chat with you later.
absolutely. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Maria.
Bye.